been 3 years since I got married, and 3 years since I've been a virgin. My husband is Adrian Harrow, Rear Admiral of the Royal Navy, the flawless heir to the Harrow dynasty, the most powerful man on the naval base of Portsmouth. We live in the Harrow estate, an old mansion overlooking the harbor, where the sea breeze smells of salt and secrets. Tonight marks our 3rd wedding anniversary. The house is full of laughter, clinking glasses, and starched uniforms, but I'm not among them. I sit alone in the cold room that has been assigned to me, the one that will never be the bridal chamber. Why? Because of the rule, the Harrow Rule, an ancient, absurd, and merciless tradition. The new wife must obtain a favorable draw, a good omen, before she is permitted to consummate the union, before she is allowed into the nuptial bed. 3 years, 98 draws, 98 times, the coins landed wrong. 98 times, fate declared me unlucky. I am Thalie Renaud, the youngest chief of staff the Navy has ever known. I've handled international crises, coordinated fleets, earned the respect of thousands of men. But here, in this house, I am nothing. I am the unlucky one, the cursed star, the woman unworthy of the Harrow blessing. I hear Adrian's voice downstairs, deep and confident, full of charm. He says he loves me, or at least, he says the words. Every night, after another failed draw, he comes to me in this guest room. He takes my hand, eyes full of tenderness that feels like poison. Thalie, he murmurs, his voice gentle, almost holy. It's all right. We have time. My family's tradition must be respected. He holds me. A chaste, respectful embrace. The embrace of a brother, not a husband. He honors the rule. He honors me, he says. But that honor is a prison. At first, I thought it was a test, a way for his family to gauge my patience. I played along, I smiled, I waited, I prayed before their ancestral altar. The first year, whispers drifted quietly through the base. The second year, they became laughter. The chief of staff who can't even share her husband's bed. By the 3rd year, pity replaced mockery. My subordinates look at me with professional respect and personal sorrow. They no longer see a strategist. They see the cursed one. Tonight, the air feels heavier. It's the 99th draw. The ceremony is always the same. It takes place in the family's private chapel, at the heart of the estate. A cold room that smells of incense and centuries of dust. I rise. I smooth my dress, simple, elegant. Adrian always says I look like a queen, even in defeat. I walk down the corridors. The portraits of Harrow ancestors stare at me, their painted eyes full of judgment. Unworthy. Adrian isn't there. He's still with his guests. Unusual. He normally presides over the draw. I push open the heavy oak door of the chapel. It's empty. Only the candles flicker. The urn holding the divination coins sits on the altar. A sudden impulse grips me, a weariness so deep it burns like anger. 3 years of my life, my youth, my pride, all sacrificed for a ridiculous game of chance. What if I cheated? The thought makes me tremble. Me, Thalie Renaud, defying fate. I step toward the altar. My heart races. Just once. Just to see what a good omen looks like. Just to end this farce. I reach for the urn, and then I hear it. A sound. I freeze. Step back into the deepest shadow, behind a marble pillar. The door opens again, slowly. It's Adrian. He's alone. He doesn't see me. His face is different, tense. Not the patient, loving husband from an hour ago. He walks to the altar. He doesn't look for me. He doesn't wait. He dips his hand into the urn, takes the coins, casts them onto the velvet tray. I hold my breath. I know the combination by heart. 2 faces, 1 crest. Grand omen. The favorable draw. A foolish joy rushes through me for a split second. It's over. The curse is broken. But Adrian doesn't smile. He doesn't look relieved. He stands motionless, staring at the coins. Then, slowly, he reaches into his uniform pocket and pulls something out. A photograph. I narrow my eyes in the dim light. It's a woman. A young woman with a bright, radiant smile. I recognize her. Vivian Harrow. The family's adopted daughter. His adopted sister. She's been living abroad for years. Adrian rarely speaks of her, but when he does, his voice changes. Adrian places the photo on the altar, right beside the favorable draw. He strokes Vivian's face on the glossy paper, his hand trembling, and he speaks. He speaks to the photo. His voice is low, strangled by an emotion I've never heard from him. Vivian, he murmurs. 3 years. It's been 3 years. He pauses. The silence in the chapel is suffocating. I've made so many favorable draws. So many times it was grand omen. But you still refuse to come back. My blood runs cold. What? I keep changing them, he whispers. I keep giving her the bad draws, just to wait for you. He looks at the photograph, eyes filled with a desperate kind of madness. This is the last time, Vivi. I promise you. The last time I change fate for you. And there, before my eyes, Adrian Harrow, my husband, the man of honor, slowly, deliberately reaches out and flips one of the coins. The grand omen becomes grand misfortune. Adrian didn't even glance around. His world had narrowed to the altar, the manipulated coins, and the small, glossy photograph of Vivian. He stood up, his tall figure a dark silhouette against the flickering candlelight. And he spoke again, not to me, but to the silence, to the waiting specter of his own betrayal. 3 years, Vivi, 3 long years. I have kept her out of my bed. I have kept myself pure for you. Every draw, every single time I had to ensure the coin fell the wrong way, just so I could wait a little longer, just so the purity of the Harrow bloodline wouldn't be sullied by a promise I never meant to keep. I felt a dizzying coldness spread from my chest, freezing every vein, every thought. It wasn't just a betrayal. It was an absolute demolition of my reality. The Harrow Rule, that sacred, ancient tradition Adrian had defended with such solemn dignity, it was a farce. A meticulous, cruel deception orchestrated by him, my husband, to keep a placeholder wife in cold storage, while he waited for his true love. I stepped back further, pressing my spine against the cold marble. My heart was not racing. It was still, an inert stone in my ribcage. The anger that had fueled my walk to the chapel was gone, replaced by a profound, agonizing emptiness. I recalled the very first time Lady Margaret, Adrian's mother, had explained the rule to me. It was the morning after my wedding. I was still naive, still beaming with the hope of a young bride. She had led me to the chapel, pointing to the carvings above the altar, to the symbol of the two-sided coin. The rule is sacred, child, she had said, her voice a low, iron whisper. It is the shield of the Harrow name. It keeps the bloodline pure. We do not risk it on chance. We wait for the omen that the ancestors themselves approve of. I had nodded, humbled by the weight of their tradition. Pure. That single word echoed now, corrupted and grotesque. Pure. Not morally untainted, not spiritually clean, but pure in the literal, biological sense. Kept intact. Kept away from me, the interloper, the naval officer from a modest, non-aristocratic family. I was not meant to be the Harrow heir's wife. I was meant to guard the heir until the preferred candidate returned. Adrian finally moved. He took the manipulated coins from the tray, dropped them back into the wooden urn, and placed Vivian's photo back in his pocket. He turned to leave, his face smoothing back into the familiar mask of the patient, dutiful husband. I let him go. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The sound of the heavy door closing was the sound of a guillotine falling on my marriage. I remained behind the pillar for what felt like hours. The scent of stale incense and newly crushed deceit mingled in the air. 98 times. I ran the number through my mind. 98 times I had stood here, publicly humiliated, believing in my own bad luck, fighting my own rising despair. 98 times he had looked me in the eye, tenderly, and lied with every molecule of his being. It was the emptiness that finally broke me. I wasn't crying over a lost husband. I was crying over a lost self. The woman who had believed she was entering a partnership, a covenant. The woman who had fought so hard to prove her worth to a family that saw her as little more than a shield. My knees buckled. I sank onto the cold stone floor, the sound of my silk dress rustling an indecent noise in the sacred silence. The tears came, not in dramatic sobs, but in a quiet, relentless flow. They weren't tears of injury, but of understanding. This wasn't a tragedy of two people who stopped loving each other. This was a tragedy of one person's monstrous manipulation, using an ancient ritual to justify his cowardice. I stood up, wiping my face with a trembling hand. The makeup felt gritty under my fingers. The chapel was still now, the candles burning lower, casting long, menacing shadows that writhed on the walls. I walked out. The manor was quiet, the guests long gone. The hall where the ceremony was supposed to happen was already being silently cleaned by the estate staff. I passed my assigned room without a second glance and walked through the back garden gate. The night air hit me, sharp, cold, and wet. It was raining now, a relentless drizzle typical of the English coast. I walked toward the edge of the cliff, overlooking the channel, the rough, ancient stones digging into the soles of my thin shoes. I looked down at the churning black water, crashing against the base of the Dover cliffs. The sea was endless, indifferent, vast. I gripped the cold, damp railing, the raindrops running down my face, mixing with my tears. If fate, the very foundation of my endurance and my hope for 3 years, was nothing more than a carefully orchestrated lie, if the divine will of the ancestors was just the selfish impulse of a man manipulating coins in the dark, then what was real? What was left to believe in? I whispered the question into the roaring wind, the voice of the sea swallowing my despair whole. If destiny is just a rigged game, then what the hell am I supposed to believe in? I stayed there until the first sliver of bruised gray light appeared on the horizon, the dawn cold and unforgiving. I returned to the Harrow estate with the rising tide, my dress soaked, my mind crystalline. The woman who had left last night, broken, humiliated, begging for answers from the indifferent sea, was gone. In her place stood Thalie Renaud, the chief of staff, the strategist, a woman who now knew the field of battle. The sun, what little there was of it on the English coast, did nothing to warm the dining hall. The air was thick with polite tension, a flavor more bitter than the weak coffee. The traditional family breakfast was in full swing. Adrian sat at the head of the long oak table, impeccable in his dress uniform, chatting lightly about naval logistics with an easy charm. He acted as if the 99th grand misfortune and his secret manipulation in the chapel had never happened. He looked up as I entered. His eyes held the usual gentle pity, the patient suffering of a man bound by an inconvenient, archaic law. "Thalie, my dear, you look tired," he said, his voice laced with concern. "You should have rested. The rule demands so much of us, doesn't it?" I offered him a small, controlled smile. "It does, Adrian, but tradition must be respected." I sat down, the scent of damp wool clinging to me, a silent accusation in the overly formal room. Lady Margaret, Adrian's mother, surveyed me from the opposite end of the table. Her expression was sharper than Adrian's, her judgment always visible beneath a thin layer of aristocratic politesse. "The rule is a discipline, Thalie," she stated, not as a comfort, but as a rebuke. "It builds character. 99 failures is a great spiritual test." Adrian reached across the table and touched my hand, a public gesture of solidarity, a private act of utter falsehood. I pulled my hand back slowly, deliberately, pretending to rearrange my napkin. "Indeed, mother," Adrian agreed smoothly, "but the ancestors are merciful. Thalie has shown immense patience." Lady Margaret placed her knife and fork down with a sharp click that silenced the room. "Which brings us to the matter at hand," she announced, her eyes fixed on me. "The 100th draw." My stomach tightened, but I kept my face impassive. "Tomorrow shall be the 100th draw," Lady Margaret continued, her voice gaining a severe resonance. "The final chance. If the grand omen is not granted tomorrow, the marriage will be deemed permanently unsanctified. The union will be annulled, and the Harrow bloodline will remain protected." Adrian's expression shifted, a flicker of panic hidden quickly by a look of noble resignation. He knew what that meant. He would lose the temporary shield I provided, and the pressure to produce a pure heir would intensify. "Mother, there's no need for such haste," Adrian tried to interject, but she cut him off with a look. "Haste? 3 years is hardly haste, Adrian. It is time for fate to speak its final word. Be ready, Thalie. It is a long night ahead." The conversation dissolved into nervous, stilted small talk, but I heard none of it. The final chance. The ultimate deadline. The end of the road paved with his lies. Later that afternoon, I returned to the chapel. It felt less like a sanctuary and more like a crime scene. Adrian had been thorough. The altar was spotless, the coins back in their urn, the velvet tray brushed clean of any trace of metallic dust. I walked to the back of the chamber, past the sacristy where the ceremonial objects were stored. I knew Adrian had used a different set of coins to rig the draw. The ones in the urn were too sacred, too often examined. He needed substitutes. I remembered the sounds I had heard after he left last night. A soft sweeping, a careful putting away. I found a small, locked mahogany chest tucked beneath a dusty pile of old vestments. It didn't require a key, only a certain pressure on a concealed latch. a technique I'd learned from breaking into naval safes. The latch clicked. Inside, nestled in worn green velvet, lay a dozen coins. They looked identical to the ancient Harrow divination coins. The same patina, the same weight, the same stylized faces and crests. But they were too clean, too perfect. A new box of tricks. These were the props of the Harrow Rule. Adrian's tools of manipulation, the true coins of fate. Beneath the coins, there was a folded piece of brittle, aged parchment. I unfolded it carefully. It was a letter, penned in a delicate, looping script, dated 1912. The letter was from a former Lady Harrow, one whose name had been quietly removed from the family history. "My dearest father," it began. "I write this to you in despair, but also in a strange moment of clarity. I have failed the draw again. 10 years and 10 failures. My husband's love has turned to ice, not because of the rule, but because the rule itself is his shield against me. He does not desire the omen. He desires control. The rule is not divine. It is not a test of faith. It is a test of obedience. They wanted a silent, compliant wife who would accept her fate and wait for a destiny he alone controls. I failed the test. I broke my vow, not to the ancestors, but to my own heart. I am leaving. Do not look for me. Let the Harrows believe fate defeated me. I hope one day another woman will see the truth before her spirit is entirely consumed by this cold, magnificent house." The paper trembled in my hands. I wasn't the first. I wasn't the cursed one. I was just the 99th successor in a long line of women who had been sacrificed on the altar of a man's pride and desire for control. The curse was not fate. The curse was the men who created the tradition. I looked at the false coins, then at the ancient letter. The women of this family, including Vivian, were pawns in a game designed to keep the power and the purity exactly where the men wanted it. I placed the letter back. I carefully selected 2 of Adrian's fake coins, the ones he had used to fake the grand omen, then flipped to fake the misfortune. I slipped them into the inner pocket of my jacket. They felt heavy, cold, and immensely powerful. I walked out of the chapel, the gloom of the old stone building momentarily lifting. I went to my assigned room, locked the door, and looked into the mirror. My face was pale, my eyes ringed with sleepless exhaustion, but there was a fierce, new light in them. I spoke the words softly, to my own reflection, a solemn promise to the woman in the dusty letter and to myself. Let's see what happens when fate cheats back. The 100th draw was less than 12 hours away. The morning after Lady Margaret's ultimatum, the Harrow estate felt like a sealed tomb waiting for the final rite. I woke up with the cold metal of Adrian's counterfeit coins pressed against my chest, a physical reassurance of my new purpose. I was no longer waiting for salvation. I was preparing for war. The war, however, found its first casualty before I could fire a shot. I was in the small office I used on the estate, reviewing naval reports, trying to keep a semblance of professional sanity. A junior aide, Lieutenant Foster, knocked tentatively and entered. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and sheer awe. "Ma'am, Commander Harrow has just arrived at the base. Unannounced, no prior warning." My mind raced. Adrian was Rear Admiral, not Commander. The only person he referred to as Commander was Vivian Harrow, Foster whispered, as if speaking her name aloud might summon a storm. She came by private helicopter, landed right on the old pad. The news ripped through the cold tension of the house like a shockwave. Adrian had been waiting 3 years, manipulating fate, keeping his wife at bay, all for her. And now, Vivian was here. I felt a perverse sense of relief. The antagonist had finally stepped onto the stage. The waiting game was over. Adrian, always a master of composure, failed spectacularly. He rushed from his study, his uniform slightly askew, his face a landscape of conflicting emotions. Shock, desperate hope, and a sudden, terrifying vulnerability. He barely spared a glance for me as he raced towards the front door. I followed, maintaining a measured, professional pace. I needed to see her, to measure the ghost that had haunted my marriage. Vivian stood in the great hall, surrounded by Lady Margaret and a handful of stunned staff. She was exquisite. Not classically beautiful, but strikingly so. Her hair was a dark, liquid cascade, and her eyes, a deep, unsettling hazel, held the look of someone who had seen too much of the world and was profoundly bored by it. She didn't wear an expensive gown. She was in simple, tailored silk trousers and a cashmere coat. a civilian elegance that mocked the rigid uniforms and traditions of the Harrow home. She carried herself with the kind of casual confidence I had only seen in successful spies or fallen royalty. She was the Angelus Caducus, the fallen angel of Adrian's affections. Adrian stopped dead 10 feet from her. His throat worked. He didn't speak. He couldn't. Vivian smiled, a slow, sensual movement that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Adrian, my dear brother," she said, her voice low and husky, the sound of expensive London clubs and secrets exchanged over aged whiskey. "Did you really think I wouldn't return for the 100th roll?" She hadn't come for him. She had come for the ceremony. Lady Margaret recovered first, her face a mask of iron control. "Vivian, darling, we thought you were still in Geneva." "Geneva was tedious, mother," Vivian replied, turning her chilling gaze on Lady Margaret. "And the 100th draw is rarely tedious. It is, after all, when the final lie is told." Her eyes then found me, Thalie Renaud, the interloper, the wife. Her gaze was not hostile, merely analytical, assessing the quality of the temporary barrier Adrian had erected. "And you must be Thalie," Vivian said, walking towards me. Her steps were silent on the marble floor. I held out my hand, offering a handshake that was military crisp and professionally neutral. "Admiral's wife. Welcome home, Commander Harrow." She ignored my hand. Instead, she leaned in, her scent a complex mixture of expensive perfume and something sharp. "Perhaps the metallic tang of ambition," she whispered, her breath brushing my ear, low enough so only I could hear. "You must think I'm the curse, the wicked woman who corrupted your man of honor." She drew back slowly, her eyes locking onto mine, a cold, dangerous intelligence shining there. "But darling," she finished, her voice rising just enough to sound like a brittle courtesy to the others, "I'm just the mirror, the one who shows the honorable man exactly what he is." The encounter was over in a heartbeat, leaving the hall vibrating with unspoken history. Adrian had finally found his voice, a desperate, raw sound. He tried to take her arm, to pull her into a private conversation. "Vivi, we need to talk. About everything. About why you left." Vivian pulled her arm away, her movement subtle but absolute. "There is nothing to talk about, Adrian. Not until after the omen. Until the rule is satisfied, we are all bound to play our parts, aren't we?" She walked away, up the grand staircase, leaving Adrian standing alone, his image of control shattered. He looked more pathetic than powerful, a rear admiral reduced to a waiting boy. I watched him. The man who had been the architect of my pain was now a victim of his own delayed desire. The coin of betrayal had flipped. I turned and walked back to my office, the whisper of Vivian's words echoing in my mind. "I'm just the mirror." If she was the mirror, then Adrian's heart was truly dark, reflecting not love, but a calculated 3-year-long act of hypocrisy. The evening brought the annual Naval Gala, a mandatory social ritual where the Harrows displayed their flawless veneer to the elite of the Royal Navy. Tonight, the performance had higher stakes, complicated by Vivian's unexpected arrival. I dressed in the required formality, a gown that Lady Margaret had chosen, expensive, tasteful, and utterly forgettable. A dress designed for a woman who was meant to fade into the background. When I entered the grand ballroom, the air immediately shifted. The gossip wasn't about naval deployments or the latest political scandal. It was entirely focused on the 2 women of the Harrow house. The official wife, Thalie, who had failed the draw 99 times, and Vivian, Adrian's legendary and unofficial flame, who had returned just before the final draw. Adrian, recognizing the escalating tension, decided to quash all rumors with a definitive statement. He stood on the small dais reserved for speeches, the light catching his white dress uniform. After the usual pleasantries about naval stability and family traditions, he paused, his eyes sweeping across me, then settling on Lady Margaret. "Friends, colleagues, and family," Adrian began with a commanding voice, though I detected a slight tremor. "For 3 years, my wife, Thalie, has endured the most sacred and rigorous of our family rites. She has demonstrated patience, faith, and discipline worthy of the Harrow name." He raised his champagne glass. "Tomorrow night, she will do so for the last time. Tomorrow shall be the 100th draw, the final chance for the ancestors to bless our union. And I am confident they will." He raised his glass higher, looking directly at me. "Tomorrow, my wife shall perform the final draw. And when she succeeds, The Harrow lineage shall continue through her. We drink to the purity of the family. Lady Margaret offered a cold, satisfied smile. She raised her glass, blessing the moment with solemn words. To the purity of the family. I raised my own glass, but my focus remained on Vivian, who stood quietly in a corner of the room. Vivian showed no visible reaction to Adrian's proclamation. She merely turned her wrist slightly, and as she did, the chandelier light caught a flash of brilliance at her throat. I narrowed my eyes. It was a necklace. It wasn't ordinary jewelry. It was the Harrow crest, the family medallion traditionally passed down only to the chosen woman who would bear the heir. It was the symbol of an official promise, the most ancient artifact in the family's collection. Adrian had given it to Vivian before he married me. This confirmed a painful suspicion. I was not a wife, I was a placeholder. Adrian had promised the bloodline to Vivian, but for some reason, likely related to his mother's rigid traditions or the terms of the inheritance, he had been forced to marry me to maintain the appearance of a legal union. After the speech, I sought out Vivian. She was in the library, her fingers tracing the spine of a book. The room, smelling of parchment and aged oak, was the only place shielded from the party noise. "The necklace suits you," I said, my voice level, devoid of any emotional tremor. Vivian turned. She wasn't surprised to see me. She had been waiting. "It's heavy," Vivian replied, gripping the medallion. "The weight of a promise made in another life. He gave it to me 3 years ago, before I left for London." "Why did you leave?" I asked, cutting to the core. "He rigged the draws, keeping me, a virgin wife, waiting for you. If you are the one he wants, why weren't you here?" Vivian scoffed, a dry, bitter sound. "You still believe he is a romantic, tragic hero, don't you, Thalie? You still believe the rule is about love. It's about control," I corrected her, recalling the century-old letter. "Exactly, and I challenged that control." Vivian stepped closer to me. "You think I left because I was afraid of the rule? I left because Adrian sent me away." The unexpected twist left me momentarily breathless. "He sent you away? The rule is sacred, remember?" Vivian whispered. "My mother, Margaret, and Adrian, they are obsessed with the purity of the lineage. I am his adopted sister, Thalie. My blood is not Harrow blood. He feared I'd ruin the lineage in his mother's eyes. Or worse, that our children would not be seen as pure enough to uphold the legacy." She looked at me with profound bitterness. "He wanted me, yes, desperately, but he feared the consequences of defying his mother more. So he sent me to London, promising to bring me back when he was strong enough to break the rule for me. While he took a suitable wife, youth, to satisfy the public and appease his mother. You are the perfect decoy. You are the lineage shield." I stepped back, reeling from the cold calculation of the lie. Adrian hadn't been waiting nobly. He had rejected both of us out of fear of his mother and the stifling tradition. Vivian grabbed my arm, a surprisingly strong grip. "Don't be fooled. He feared I would ruin the lineage, but you, Thalie, you married into it. He fears what you might do if you ever truly realized what kind of man he is. You are the danger he never saw coming, because you believe in honor. He doesn't." "Why did you come back now, Vivian?" Vivian smiled, a look devoid of any angelic quality, filled instead with the sharp coldness of someone joining the fray. "To see if you are a better woman than I was. To see if you have the courage to break his control, because I never could. And also, to claim what was promised to me, whether he wins the draw or not." The night of the 100th draw descended upon the Harrow estate, heavy and silent, like a shroud. The atmosphere was different tonight. There was no polite, weary tension, but a palpable sense of finality. The guests were gone, leaving only the inner sanctum. Adrian, Lady Margaret, the officiating cleric, and me. Vivian was conspicuously absent, her return having served its purpose, to sharpen Adrian's anxiety and solidify my resolve. I prepared in my assigned room. I put on the simple white gown, the color mocking my status. The old me would have prayed, trembling with manufactured hope. The new me simply checked my pocket. Adrian's 2 counterfeit coins, my instruments of fate, were secure. Adrian met me at the door to the chapel. He wore the expression of a man facing a firing squad with honor. He looked tired, lines of stress etched around his eyes. He tried to take my hand. "Thalie," he murmured, his voice strained. "Whatever the ancestors decide tonight, know that I respect you." I offered him a look that was polite, distant, and utterly devoid of genuine emotion. "I know, Adrian, and I respect the rule. We entered the chapel, and the air was thick with smoke from the incense, and the oppressive weight of 3 centuries of tradition. Lady Margaret stood beside the altar, overseeing the placement of the sacred urn. Her eyes burned with a feverish expectation. The cleric began the lengthy, sonorous chant, tracing the history of the Harrow bloodline and the sanctity of the draw. Adrian and I knelt at the altar, the polished wood cold beneath our knees. Lady Margaret presented the urn. The cleric blessed it, murmuring the ancient incantations. Adrian's task was to draw the 3 coins and place them on the velvet tray. My task was to turn them over when the cleric shouted the grand omen call. In the dim light, under the cover of the cleric's booming voice, Adrian reached into the urn. His movements were precise, practiced. He drew the 3 coins and placed them on the tray. This was the moment. The 3 coins, the real ones, the sacred ones, lay face down on the velvet. Adrian reached out his hand, moving slowly, as if in slow motion, to turn the coins. He paused, his eyes darting to the corner where Vivian usually stood, the corner where she was supposed to be. His expression was a fleeting, agonizing mix of love, regret, and the fear of his mother's disapproval. He was ready to accept whatever fate granted, but his heart was still searching for the impossible. This is your last chance to choose honor, Adrian, I thought. Your last chance to not manipulate. The cleric's voice rose to a crescendo. The moment of truth. Lady Thalie, prepare the coins. Adrian, perhaps in a final, subconscious act of self-betrayal, hesitated. I took my chance. My left hand, under the shield of my billowing sleeve, moved swiftly and silently. My fingers brushed Adrian's wrist. A cold, brief contact. In that millisecond, I performed the exchange. I palmed the 3 sacred, unmanipulated coins, and in their place, I slipped the 2 counterfeit coins I had taken from the mahogany box, plus 1 that was guaranteed to fall favorably. I used his own tools of deceit against him. Adrian didn't notice. His eyes were still fixed on the empty space where Vivian should have been. My hands hovered over the tray. The 3 substituted coins lay face down. The cleric's voice cracked with intensity. By the grace of the ancestors, I command you, grand omen! I swept my hand across the tray and flipped the coins over. 2 faces, 1 crest, grand omen, the favorable draw, the perfect combination. The ancestors had finally approved. A wave of astonished silence swept through the chapel. Lady Margaret's stiff posture instantly melted into an expression of ecstatic, triumphant relief. The cleric collapsed in satisfied exhaustion. Adrian looked down at the coins. He saw the perfect alignment. He saw the end of his 3-year penance. He saw the possibility of a new beginning, a legitimate claim on the rest of his life. He looked up at me, his eyes gleaming with a kind of desperate, fragile victory. He thought he had won. He thought he had outsmarted fate, appeased his mother, and secured his legacy. He leaned in, his lips brushing mine for the first time in 3 years. It was not a kiss of passion, nor even affection. It was a kiss of proprietorship, of relief, of a covenant fulfilled, the kiss of a captor finally claiming his prize. As he pulled back, before the triumphant shouting of Lady Margaret could drown me out, I looked him straight in his victorious, relieved eyes. I whispered, my voice clear and cold, right against his ear. Now we are truly bound by fate, mine, not yours. Then, I did something I had rehearsed in my mind 100 times. I stood up, calmly, decisively. I didn't wait for the congratulatory embraces. I didn't look back at the coins. I walked out of the chapel, leaving Adrian kneeling alone, the victor, on the cold stone before the altar, staring at the perfectly manipulated grand omen, the blessing he thought was his. The news spread through the Harrow estate, and then through the entire Portsmouth naval base, with the speed of wildfire. Rear Admiral Harrow's wife finally won the draw. The century-old rule is satisfied. The staff bustled with genuine, relieved joy. Lady Margaret immediately began issuing commands for the preparation of the bridal chamber, her voice triumphant. She had her pure bloodline, secured by the ancestors' approval. I, however, was already gone. I walked out the back gate, past the silent helicopter pad where Vivian had landed, and disappeared into the coastal night. The breaking began subtly, in the cold heart of the chapel. Adrian, still basking in the glow of his supposed victory and the fulfilled promise, finally stood from the altar. He looked down at the velvet tray, at the perfect alignment of the grand omen. He needed to put the sacred coins back in the urn, to secure the proof of his destiny. He reached for them, and then he paused. The 3 coins felt slightly different. He was intimately familiar with the sacred coins, their weight, their nicks, the unique patina of centuries. He turned them over, examining the edges in the dim, dancing candlelight. He ran his thumb across the metal. They were immaculate, too smooth, too uniform. His blood ran cold. He recognized them. They were the perfect, unmarked, newly minted fakes he kept in the locked mahogany chest. The victory shattered. The relief turned into a blinding, suffocating fury. He had been played, outsmarted. The game had been rigged, not by him, but against him. He frantically searched the altar. He found the small, folded parchment I had left tucked beneath the ceremonial book. It wasn't the old letter from 1912. It was a single, stark sheet of my own naval stationery. His hands trembled as he read my final dispatch. Adrian, the coins you used tonight are the ones you used last night. The draw was grand omen, but the outcome is grand misfortune. For you, not for me. The rule was never divine. It was a test of obedience, as one of your previous lineage shields learned long ago. I passed the test by refusing the obedience. I am taking the real coins. I am taking the fate you manipulated for 3 years. The rule dies with me, so does your control. I chose my own omen, Thalie. The note dropped from his numb fingers. He stared at the altar, then back at the empty, gaping space where I should have been. The silence of the chapel seemed to mock his pathetic 3-year vigil. He tried to scream, but only a ragged gasp escaped. He was a rear admiral, the heir to the Harrow name, a master of strategy, and he had been systematically dismantled by the woman he considered his insignificant placeholder. Lady Margaret found him there an hour later, still kneeling, the note clutched in his hand, the counterfeit coins scattered across the stone floor. She read the note, her face draining of all color. "She's broken the bloodline," Lady Margaret whispered, the words trembling with a terror that transcended the loss of a son's honor. "She didn't just leave you, Adrian. She broke the legacy." The news reached Vivian in her London flat hours later. It wasn't Adrian who told her. It was a terse, panicked call from a distant cousin. She was packing again, preparing to make her final, decisive return. She stopped. She looked at the Harrow crest medallion around her neck. Thalie had solved the problem with an elegance Vivian could never have achieved. Thalie hadn't just fought Adrian, she had demolished the entire structure of the rule, making the inheritance and the entire lineage irrelevant. Vivian took off the heavy gold medallion, the symbol of a false promise, and a fearful man. She dropped it into her suitcase. Not with anger, but with a profound, quiet understanding. She left London immediately, but this time, she didn't come to Portsmouth. She went somewhere new. No one tried to stop her. Meanwhile, I was standing on the edge of the cliffs of Dover. The wind was fierce, whipping my hair around my face. I looked out over the vast, turbulent water, the same sea that had borne the ships of the Harrows for generations. I took the small, heavy package from my coat, the real, ancient Harrow divination coins. They were cold in my hand, carrying the weight of all the women who had been sacrificed to them. I threw them, one by one, into the furious channel waves. Each splash was a sound of finality, a broken promise dissolving into the salt spray. I reached up and untied the thin, expensive silk handkerchief Adrian had given me on our wedding day, the one he called my bridal token. It was meant to symbolize the purity he guarded. I ripped it in half, then let the pieces fly into the gale. The tattered, white silk caught the last, weak light of the setting sun before it was torn away by the wind, drifting over the ancient, indifferent sea. I was no longer the cursed star. I was the architect of my own release. I drove for 6 hours, the rental car eating up the miles between Dover and the quiet, fog-shrouded coast of Cornwall. I wasn't running from Adrian or Lady Margaret. I was running toward the only true anchor I had left, my father. He was a man I had cut out of my life 10 years ago, a former naval chaplain, Commander Charles Renaud. He had left the Navy after a quiet scandal involving his outspoken criticism of the military's rigid, ancestral class system. When I married Adrian, aligning myself with the very aristocracy my father despised, the final break was made. He lived in a small, stone cottage tucked into the cliffs, a place that smelled permanently of sea salt, damp wool, and stale pipe smoke. I knocked. The door opened slowly. He was older, his hair thinner, but his eyes, those clear, uncompromising gray eyes, were exactly as I remembered them. They saw everything. He didn't look surprised to see me. He simply nodded and stepped aside. Thalie, I've been expecting you in a way, he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. Father, I managed. The word, feeling foreign on my tongue after years of silence. He led me into the tiny living room. A single fire burned in the hearth, casting the room in a warm, honest light that felt alien after the magnificent, cold grandeur of the Harrow estate. He didn't ask why I was soaked, or why I had a hollow look in my eyes. He simply poured 2 glasses of aged whiskey and waited. Tell me everything, he commanded gently. I told him. I started with the absurdity of the rule, the 99 failed draws, the years of public humiliation. I told him about the mahogany box, the ancient letter from the doomed Lady Harrow of 1912. I told him about Vivian, Adrian's fear, and the pure, calculated cruelty of his 3-year charade. And finally, I told him about the 100th draw, the exchange of the coins, the kiss of liberation, and the final, irrevocable message I left behind. I finished my story, the words leaving a bitter taste in my mouth, the entire confession ending with a heavy silence. My father sat back, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. He didn't offer comfort or judgment. The Harrows, he finally said, his gaze fixed on the fire. They don't believe in God, Thalie. They never did. They believe in themselves. They believe their bloodline is the only divinity worth worshipping. The rule was never about fate. It was about ensuring that only a compliant vessel, the woman, was permitted to participate in their worship. He turned to me, his eyes piercing. They demanded you be obedient. They demanded you be a victim. I broke the covenant, Father, I whispered, shame mixing with the cold triumph. I cheated. I manipulated them just as Adrian manipulated me. He set his glass down. The sound was sharp. You didn't cheat, Thalie. You performed a strategic correction. You refused to let the wound inflicted on you repeat itself. That is not cheating. That is the truest act of self-preservation. He stood and walked to the mantelpiece, where an old framed photograph of him in his chaplain uniform stood next to a copy of his dishonorable discharge papers. I left the Navy because I was a coward, he admitted, his voice rough. I saw the corruption. I saw the arrogance of men like Adrian and his mother, and I chose to quietly withdraw, to save my soul. I allowed them to win. I let them maintain their godless rituals. He looked at me, a profound, aching pride in his eyes. But you, he said, his voice dropping to a near reverent tone, you stood on the altar of their false religion, and you did what I never could. You ended it. You broke the curse of their obedience. You prevented that wound from ever being passed down to the next generation of women they would have trapped. Tears finally welled in my eyes, not of grief, but of profound, overwhelming absolution. I had spent 10 years believing I needed his approval, and then 3 years believing I needed Adrian's acceptance. I'm sorry, I choked out, not for breaking the rule, but for leaving him. He walked over to me, kneeling by my chair, and took my trembling hands in his. Do not be sorry for your strength, Thalie. You have paid the price of freedom in full. Now go and claim it. I leaned forward, burying my face in his shoulder, the coarse wool of his old sweater smelling like home, like truth. Thank you, Father, I murmured. It was the most honest, liberating word I had spoken in 3 years. The confession was over. The absolution was granted. The battle for my soul was won. The silence of Cornwall was the calm before the storm. The full consequences of my action hit the Harrow dynasty not as a trickle, but as a flood tide of public outrage and official scrutiny. I had been careful. Before leaving, I had compiled a meticulous file. The digitized copy of the 1912 letter, the documentation of the rigged coin manufacturer, and a written, detailed affidavit outlining the 3-year manipulation of the sacred rule. I sent it to a trusted, high-level contact at a major London investigative newspaper, with strict instructions for delayed release. 2 days after the 100th draw, the headlines exploded. The Harrow Rule, purity ritual or calculated cruelty. The rule was exposed not as a quaint tradition, but as a systematic form of marital coercion, psychological abuse, and a blatant manipulation of naval society. The narrative of Adrian Harrow, the patient, honorable rear admiral, crumbled instantly. He was revealed as a narcissistic puppet master, using an archaic tradition to maintain control over women and lineage, all for the approval of his mother. The Naval Ministry reacted with swift, brutal efficiency, The Harrow name was too public, too intertwined with high command for the scandal to be contained. A military investigation was launched immediately. Adrian was placed under formal review, not just for the marital deception, but for the potential abuse of his position, using family power and reputation to enforce a private, non-sanctioned law. Within a week, the Rear Admiral was stripped of his command and faced a disciplinary hearing that would certainly end his career. Lady Margaret, the proud matriarch, was the second to fall. The humiliation was too great, the loss of control too absolute. Her carefully constructed world, built on the foundations of purity and obedience, was destroyed by her son's victim. She began experiencing acute psychological distress, railing against the press and the blasphemy of the broken bloodline. The last I heard, she was quietly moved to a private psychiatric facility on the mainland, whispering about the stolen coins and the curse Thalie had brought upon them. The great Harrow estate, the ancient, magnificent seat of their power, became a physical symbol of their collapse. News cameras and protesters surrounded the gates. Adrian retreated entirely. The servants, having endured the silent cruelty for years, left in droves. The last image I saw of the estate, published in the papers, was chilling. A deserted, overgrown mansion. The windows were dark, and the coastal wind howled through the empty corridors, rattling the framed portraits of the judging ancestors. On the marble floor of the entrance hall, a few of the deserted counterfeit coins lay scattered, rolling slightly with every gust of wind, the worthless remnants of their obsession. Weeks later, the press frenzy subsided. I received a cryptic message through my father. Adrian wanted to meet me, one last time, away from the chaos. We met at the old parish church, near Portsmouth, a small, somber place far removed from the Harrow chapel. Adrian was in civilian clothes, a man visibly hollowed out by the loss of his identity. He looked like a stranger. He didn't plead or rage. There was only a tired, defeated honesty in his eyes. He spoke first, his voice barely audible in the vast, echoing silence of the sanctuary. "I came here to confess, Thalie, not to a priest, to you." "I'm listening, Adrian. I never hated you," he admitted, looking at the altar. "You were efficient, intelligent, and strong. That was the problem. I married you because my mother chose you for your bloodline, but I kept you out of my bed because I feared your strength. I feared that if I let you in, I would lose the only thing I truly possessed. Control," I finished for him. He nodded. A slow, painful movement. "I manipulated fate because I never loved it. I just feared losing control. I loved Vivian, yes, but the idea of having her, the imperfect bloodline, and defying my mother for her, that meant losing control of my status. So I kept you both at arm's length. You were my perfectly controlled vacuum." He finally looked at me, a profound bi-throng in his eyes. "You took everything, my rank, my mother, my house, but you gave me one thing I never earned." "What?" "The truth. I am truly free now, Thalie, free from the lie, and it costs everything." The conversation was not one of anger, nor of forgiveness. It was the quiet, bi-throng resolution between two people who had played their roles in a domestic tragedy dictated by toxic heritage. We were not enemies. We were survivors of the same curse. I stood up. "I hope you find peace, Adrian. And I hope you find joy, Thalie. You earned it." I left him there, kneeling in the empty church, a man stripped bare, finally facing his own moral solitude. The House of Harrow had fallen. A year passed. The Harrow name faded from the front pages, replaced by new scandals and fleeting political dramas. The sea, the ultimate force of cleansing, had done its work. I lived in a small, practical house near the sea in Cornwall. Not the grand, cold mansion of the Harrows, but a place where the sun actually warmed the stone, and the salt air smelled of life, not secrets. My life was no longer defined by waiting. I had returned to my passion, teaching. I now lectured at the Royal Naval College, training the next generation of officers. It was a role that felt honest and profoundly right. I wore my simple uniform with pride, my dignity no longer resting on a title or a marriage, but on my competence and my scars. The core of my lectures was not strategy or logistics. It was leadership built on integrity. I often used historical examples of moral courage, subtly weaving in the lessons of control and obedience I had learned in that cold chapel. One afternoon, After a particularly intense session on the moral price of ambition, a young female officer, sharp, idealistic, with the kind of fierce ambition I once possessed, approached me. "Ma'am, if I may ask a personal question," she inquired hesitantly. "You may, Lieutenant. Do you believe in fate?" The question hung in the air, a phantom from my past, the ghost of the Harrow Rule, the grand omen, and the rigged game. I smiled, a genuine, quiet smile that reached my eyes. It was a smile born from the deep peace of understanding. "I believe in the sea, Lieutenant. The sea is indifference. It doesn't care if you succeed or fail. It only cares about the tide." I paused, allowing the analogy to settle. "But no, I do not believe in fate that dictates our worth. I believe in choices, and in the courage to break them, to break the cycle of fear, obedience, and cruelty that was handed down to you by others. Every morning, you choose whether you will live by someone else's script or write your own." "What about the people who betray you, ma'am? How do you choose to be courageous when the initial wound is not your fault?" Her question was direct, raw, the central theme of my entire ordeal. I looked at the window, watching a gull circle high above the college. "We cannot stop others from betraying us," I said, my voice low and steady, repeating the exact message I had fought for. "But we can stop that wound from replicating itself through the next generation. We can stop it from poisoning our own decisions, from turning us into the very thing that hurt us." I looked back at the young officer, her face earnest and searching. "The greatest freedom is not the absence of chains, Lieutenant. It's the refusal to forge new ones for the next person who comes along." She saluted me, a sharp, clean gesture of respect, and walked away, turning my answer over in her mind. That evening, I took the last remaining item from my past, the one coin I had kept as a reminder, a counterfeit one that Adrian had once used to fake a bad draw. It was a symbol of all the manipulation, all the manufactured ill fortune. I walked down to the rugged Cornwall coastline, the new tide pulling in the familiar scent of brine and clean, cold water. The sun was setting, painting the water in brilliant, hopeful streaks of gold and rose. I held the coin, its false weight insignificant in my palm. It no longer held power. It was merely metal. I flung it, hard and far, into the crashing waves. The coin was swallowed instantly by the sea, lost forever to the relentless tide. I stood there, breathing deeply, watching the waves roll in, ceaseless and free. The sea didn't keep the bitterness, the pain, or the lies. It washed them away, carrying them somewhere new, making room for fresh beginnings. I looked at the horizon, my past a distant receding memory. Voiceover, calm, reflective, a quiet finality. The sea never keeps what it's given. It carries it away, somewhere new. Maybe that's what freedom means. Not forgetting the curse, but learning to let it drift. Not being the victim of fate, but becoming the author of your own calm.